here I would like to share a way to make a Baldur's Gate 3 character that's built around making big critical hits and making them often. This is what's known as a crit fishing build. The reason I think this is important is because it kind of goes against conventional D&D wisdom. Now it's well known in tabletop 5th edition D&D that crit fishing is not a very good strategy. There just aren't many ways to make critical hits reliable, and critical hits aren't very powerful even when you do get them. But in Baldur's Gate 3, things are different, and crit fishing actually can be a pretty powerful strategy. This mainly works because Baldur's Gate 3 has lots of overpowered items that interact with critical hits, and it has very few limitations on how many items you can use compared to tabletop D&D. Now, a while ago, I posted a video demonstrating a few builds like this, but a lot has changed since then. In particular, Honor Mode came out, and that changed a lot about how damage works in the game. So that means some of the things that I recommended back in that video just aren't good anymore, or maybe don't even work at all anymore. If you're curious, one of the big changes was the elimination of most DRS mechanics. If you know what that is, then you know what I mean. If you don't know what DRS is, then just suffice it to say it was a broken mechanic in the game, and at that time some of my builds back then were taking advantage of it, but Honor Mode fixed that broken mechanic. It's basically not there anymore, so builds that were taking advantage of it aren't good anymore. So there have been changes to the game, and I've also just gotten more experience myself and noticed some things that worked better than what I had suggested in the past. So the purpose of this video is to share new recommendations for making a crit fishing character that are updated to be effective in Honor Mode. I'm also going to showcase a little bit how the builds play at a few different points within the game. If you want to see a demonstration kind of in the wild to show that these builds are actually viable in Honor Mode, I did record an entire Honor Mode playthrough using two of the characters using two characters that have the builds shown here. I'll include a link to that in the description. So without further ado, here's how to make a Baldur's Gate 3 crit fishing character that's going to be good even in Honor Mode. First off, let's review the general things that we need to make a crit fishing character viable. There's broadly two things that you're going to need. One, you need ways to make sure your crits do enough damage that they're worth building around instead of building any of the other super good things you could be building. And second, you need ways to make sure that crits happen often enough that you can rely on them. So to make crits reliable, within that there's two things you need to do. You need to lower your critical threshold, and you need to roll lots of dice. To lower your critical threshold, we're going to rely mainly on the champion fighter class feature, elixirs of viciousness, and a bunch of different items that are going to lower crit threshold. To roll more dice, we're going to need ways of attacking multiple times, and we're going to need ways to always attack with advantage, right? Because attacking more times means you're rolling more dice, and attacking with advantage means you're rolling twice as many dice. We're going to get multiple attacks through the extra attack class feature and by trying to use bonus actions to attack as often as we can. And we're going to get advantage through items, although there are other ways that you could explore to do it too, and we'll look at some of them towards the end of the video when we talk about alternative ways to do this. Now, if you put all of these things together, then through most of Acts 2 and 3, you're going to have a crit threshold that's usually going to be 17, sometimes 16. Later in the game, you can get it even lower than that. And you're going to be attacking twice around with advantage, sometimes 3 times if you manage to get your bonus action in, sometimes more if you action surge or use haste or something like that. So what all that means is in the worst case scenario, you've got about a 60% chance per round of getting at least one critical hit. That's if you're making 2 attacks with advantage and your crit threshold is 17. And good case scenario, you've got about an 80% chance of getting at least one crit in a round if you're making 3 attacks and if your crit threshold is lower. So that's what we need to make crits happen often. But there's no point in critting often if your crits aren't doing something useful. So we need to make sure the crits also do more damage. To make crits do more damage, you essentially just need as many things as you can find that add damage dice. A lot of that's going to come through items. We'll look at some of the good items as we go through the builds in the video. The other biggest source of more damage dice is going to be paladin smites. Now you don't want to be smiting all the time, because if your build relies on smiting every time you attack, you're only going to be able to get through like 2 fights and then you're out of slots. So when we look at the builds in more detail, we're going to see that we've got enough sources of damage in here that they'll still do a decent job in day-to-day fights even when you're not smiting, but you do have the option to smite when you need to, and that's really important because there are those times when there's a threat that you really need to take out before it even gets its first turn, or when things are going badly in a boss fight and you're all going to die if you don't take the boss down right now or something like that. In the times like that, you've got the smites and you can pull out all the stops. Okay, so putting all of this together, right, we need ways to get advantage to attack multiple times. We need ways to have damage sources like smites. If you combine the need for extra attack, the need for champion fighter, and the need for smites, that means that the earliest time crit fishing is really going to become a viable strategy is around level 8, because that's when you can have 3 levels of fighter for improved critical hit, and 5 levels of paladin, so you're getting extra attack and enough spell slots to work with. So the build doesn't really start to be effective until level 8. That also happens to be the point in the game when you're getting access to a lot of the items that you're going to need, so that kind of works out. But it does mean that this build is not useful until Act 2, so it's not really going to help you in Act 1. And we'll talk about that a little towards the end when we discuss the limitations of this build. Alright, so those are the preliminaries, those are the general requirements that we need. With that out of the way, let's take a look at 2 different ways of building characters that will give you all of those things that you need. I'm going to show you how each of these characters looks at 3 different points within the game. First, we're going to look at early Act 2, because that's the earliest point where you have the ingredients you need for this build to start to work. Second, we're going to look at early in Act 3, which is when they really come together and start to be powerful. And it's also the point where the game starts to be a little bit harder. Most of Act 2 is so easy that you don't really need a good build to get through Act 2, but in Act 3 it starts to be useful. And finally, we're going to look at how these builds look towards the end game. So to start off, let's see how things look in Act 2. The first take on crit fishing that I'm going to show you is the dual-wielding paladin. So this is what I have Lae'zel as right now. So we need constant advantage, and the way she's going to get constant advantage is by wearing the risky ring. This does mean, you're not putting the risky ring on someone else. It is a very, it's a piece of equipment that a lot of people want, so that's a decision you're going to have to make. If you want to make this build, that means you're not having the risky ring on your sharpshooter or wherever else you might want to have it. So that's how we're getting advantage. To reduce her crit threshold, she's got 3 levels of fighter, so that's giving her improved critical hit, reduces the threshold. She holds in her offhand this Knife of the Undermounting King, which again reduces the crit threshold. She wears this Covert Cowl, which reduces the crit threshold when you're in darkness. Fortunately, most of Act 2 is in darkness, so this is going to work for us a lot of the time. And she's also going to drink an elixir of viciousness every day, which I actually have not done yet at the moment, but I'll do that before we start the next fight. And a note about the elixir of viciousness, you can actually easily get enough elixirs of viciousness to last you through the whole game. So don't be shy about drinking an elixir of viciousness every day. If you're not long resting very often, then you're only going to need about 5 of them per character per act. If you pick up every single glowy blue shadow root sack you find in Act 2, you can then craft a whole bunch of elixirs of viciousness, especially if you make one of your characters a transmutation wizard. You give them high wisdom and high medicine skill, take a level of rogue so they have medicine expertise, then you can craft double elixirs of viciousness. A lot of merchants also sell the elixir, so whenever you see one of those, buy it, and you're going to be fine. So those are how we make her crit often. Then how about how does she do extra damage? Sources of extra damage she has are this Render of Mind and Body sword, which does an extra 1d8 psychic damage, which when she attacks with advantage, and remember she's attacking with advantage all the time because of this risky ring, unless something's giving her disadvantage. In addition to that, she's got 1d4 psychic from the strange conduit ring as long as she's concentrating, and we have ways to keep her concentrating all day long. You can have her hold the hunting short bow and get a free cast of Hunter's Mark. That's a spell she can concentrate on all day if her concentration doesn't get broken. If you lose concentration on that, I don't have it yet, but soon we're going to get a different suit of armor for her, the Dark Justiciar mail, and that lets her cast Shield of Faith. It's another spell that she can concentrate on all day. If you lose both of those, it's worthwhile to use up a spell slot to cast Hunter's Mark or Shield of Faith or something to keep her concentration up and keep that psychic damage going. So those are several ways to do extra damage. If you really need it, like you're in a big fight, you can use Divine Favor. That's concentration, and it's another 1d4 damage. And finally, we don't have them yet, but pretty soon we're going to get Flawed Helldust Gloves, which give her another 1d4 damage. Later in the game, we're going to be able to add more stuff to this, and most importantly, we're going to pick up an item that lets her double all of her psychic damage, and she's doing a lot of psychic damage. But this is what you can have by early in Act 2. On top of all that, there are a few illithid powers that are going to be useful for any crit fisher, and including her. So you're going to have Luck of the Far Realms, which gives you one free critical hit, for a time when you really need a crit and you didn't get it. The other useful thing is this Cull the Weak. That makes sure you don't end up leaving someone alive with like 2 or 3 hit points, which can be super annoying, right? Because usually you want to be saving your big attack for something else, and it feels like a waste when you have to use up your attack to kill someone who only had 1 hit point left anyway. Cull the Weak just makes sure you don't have to worry about that. Right, so that is the dual-wielding crit fisher. The second take on crit fishing that I'll show you is the Great Weapon Master crit fisher. That's what I have on Minthara at the moment. So this is a bit more of a high risk, high reward character. When she's doing well, she can do a good deal more damage than the dual wielder, but once she misses an attack, she becomes useless for a few rounds. So her peaks are better than the other character, but she's not quite as reliable. For her source of having advantage all the time, she uses this Unseen Menace pike. This is where the risk I mentioned comes in. So it has this invisible property. If we look at what it does, it gives free advantage all the time, and it gives the reduction of the crit threshold. Those are the things that we want. The problem is it only does that until you miss. If you miss with an attack, it loses that property, and once that happens, you're not a crit fisher anymore. You're just a poorly optimized paladin for the next 2 rounds. So this character can be really powerful, especially with, she's using a big weapon. It's got a big 1d10 that's you're doubling when you crit. It's Great Weapon Master, so she can do the extra 10. But once she misses an attack, she's kind of useless. So we really want to make sure that she doesn't miss attacks with this. So to make sure she doesn't miss, to the whatever extent we can, we have maxed out her strength. So I've done this by using the Anti-Ethel hair, and also the strength potion that Araj Oblodra gives you if you let Astarion bite her. That gets her strength up to 20. We also have an additional plus to hit on it. You can see there's a +1 is inherent to the weapon. There's another +1 which is coming from the Drake Throat Glaive. Right. So you take the Drake Throat Glaive and you cast its Draconic Elemental weapon buff onto this weapon. Now this weapon has an extra 2 hit and an extra little bit of damage. So those are all the things we have to give her advantage and hopefully make her keep advantage by not missing with this weapon. To reduce her crit threshold, as I mentioned, the invisible property gives her a reduction, and other than that, it's essentially the same stuff as the other character had. She's going to have Elixir of Viciousness. I haven't drunk it yet right now, but once she drinks it, that's going to reduce her crit threshold. She's got Champion Fighter, gives her the improved critical hit. She does not yet have a helmet that reduces critical hit, but will get one later in the Gauntlet of Shar, which is middle of Act 2. She doesn't yet have any extra sources of crit damage other than the 1d4 that I put on it from the Drake Throat Glaive and her smites. She has this Broodmother's Revenge necklace, which is not a great source of extra damage. It sometimes does extra poison damage if you bother to set it up. Poison is one of the most useless damage types in the game. So she doesn't have much yet, but in the Gauntlet of Shar, we'll get the Dark Justiciar gloves, which will add some damage. And again, she has Divine Favor, which you can use when you really want to ramp the damage up. There are other things that you could do if you wanted to make this character better. I haven't done them here, but you could. You could be a half-orc. That's a general useful recommendation for any crit fishing character because it increases the damage dice they're going to roll. So being a half-orc would give her an extra 1d10 on top of everything else she's getting. You could be Astarion because every day once Astarion bites something, he becomes happy. He gets a +1 to hit, and that's very useful given what I was saying. The fact that you really don't want her to miss with this weapon. Those are some options. I happen to be doing it with Minthara in this playthrough. Part of the reason is because Minthara gets this soul branding bonus action, which is not amazing, but it's kind of nice, right? I can give my other crit fisher an extra little bit of damage one time. And this character, she often ends up unable to attack on her bonus action because either she didn't crit and she didn't kill anyone, so she doesn't get a bonus action attack, or she did, but she killed the only thing she can reach and she can't reach anything else, so she can't use her bonus action. In those cases, she's got this bonus action to drop on Lae'zel. It's not a lot, but it's a little bit of damage dice that can increase Lae'zel's crit. I actually haven't tried this before, so I'm excited to see how it plays. So, again, those are what these characters look like early in Act 2. Now let's try them out, see how they play. I haven't fought these Meezels yet, so we're going to kill them. First things first, we need to drink our Elixirs of Viciousness. Alright, so we're actually not going to drink Elixirs of Viciousness for this fight because I realized I haven't made any yet in this playthrough. Usually I make Gale into my Transmutation Wizard and he makes all my Elixirs of Viciousness, but in this playthrough Gale is dead because I crit failed both of the checks to get him out and he's gone. And I'm using all of my other characters for other things, so I had decided at some point that Halsin is going to be my potion maker, and I haven't gotten Halsin yet, so we don't have those elixirs yet. So we're just going to do this without the Elixirs of Viciousness and see how the crit fishers do. It should be fairly easy because we detected these guys. They don't know we're here yet, so we're going to get a surprise round. Let's start things off. Alright, so Lae'zel just got a critical hit. So again, she doesn't have many extra sources of damage, so it didn't do that much. Oh, actually, I forgot to ever... she's not concentrating on anything, so we didn't get the extra... Yeah, let's see. We got this damage, but no concentration yet. Another critical hit. This one we did get psychic damage because it was with her main weapon. And I haven't been smiting yet because, you know, this is not a fight where I really need smites. But if we don't kill these things before, you know, before they are about to get a turn, then maybe I will start to smite.
Hush now.
There's another crit. And it's gone. Now we're probably going to see the situation we have with Minthara that I mentioned before, that she critted, she earned a bonus action, but she's actually probably not going to get to use it.
News.
Because
nothing
she
important is
probably
ever
can't
easy.
reach anyone. Okay,
Wanna
Karlak,
dance?
this person.
Handy.
My tutorial messages keep coming up because I'm on a brand new computer.
I won't give
So,
in.
sorry for all that distracting messages.
Victory awaits.
Alright. Lae'zel, nothing else you can do.
You dare.
So Minthara has a bonus action, but she can't reach anyone.
I will.
So let's give Soul to Lae'zel. And if really necessary, she can throw something. If I have a throwable weapon for her. I just picked her up from the prison right before this, so I don't have much in her inventory. Oh. Oh, she attacked, you know, at the beginning of surprise round, so it used up her her action.
Still
Alright,
on my
now we
feet.
are back into a normal turn.
I am fury. I am
So,
death.
Lae'zel, how about you cast Shield of Faith on yourself? And now attack, and if we're lucky, if you crit here, you'll also get that soul branding extra damage. There's a crit. There's the damage. Right. So even without the smite, 15 piercing, 12 psychic, 16 fire, we only got that because of soul branding. We won't always get that, but it's nice when we have it. No crit, but I don't think we need it. The rest of my characters can finish this off.
I wonder if the gods are watching me.
Oh, left alive with 1 hit point. That's why you want Call the Weak. This character might have, does not have Call the Weak. So let's kill this. You know what? I should have used Karlak's turn to throw something at him so he wouldn't get an attack, but we're okay.
Time to bleed.
Alright, so there was an attack, fight, again, at pretty much the earliest time you can have these characters, and both of them did decent damage and got a lot of crits, even though I had not done much of the setup that I recommended, right? Lae'zel wasn't concentrating on anything in her first turn. Neither of them had drunk elixirs of viciousness, but they still performed pretty well. Now let's see how people look around the beginning of Act 3. So we're now at level 10, and we've gotten some useful items from Act 2. So first off, let's take a look again at the dual-wielding Crit Fisher. Now remember, as we discussed before, she's got the strange conduit ring that gives extra psychic damage. So we really want this character to always be concentrating on something to get the benefit from that ring. We now have this Dark Justiciar mail, which is going to help with that, because it gives her once per day a free cast of Shield of Faith. And that's, again, a spell that she can concentrate on all day if she doesn't get her concentration broken. If we lose that, I've added another great source of free concentration, which is the Ever-Seeing Eye. This is really the best source of free concentration you can get because it lets you cast this once per short rest. And that's usually going to be enough that you can often afford to recast it once you've got your concentration broken. This actually didn't have to wait until Act 3. This is an item that you pick up all the way back in Auntie Ethel's lair in Act 1, so we could have had this on her earlier. I just forgot about it until now. As for new sources of damage on her, we've now got the Flawed Helldust gloves on her. That gives another d4 of fire damage. Once again, this is something we could have had when we looked at it earlier. If you're playing well, you can pick up enough Infernal Iron to get this at the beginning of Act 2. In this playthrough, I just happened to miss out on the check to get the Infernal Iron and Grimforge, so I had to wait until the end of Act 2 to get the iron to make this. But normally you could have had this on her during Act 2. But the most important upgrade to her damage is not from any equipment, it's from this Resonance Stone, which you pick up in the Illithid colony at the end of Act 2. This makes everybody nearby vulnerable to psychic damage, so all the various psychic damage she's doing is going to get doubled. Now, everybody nearby includes her. It also makes her herself vulnerable to psychic damage, so you're going to want to be careful when you're fighting things that do psychic damage. That's mainly going to be Mind Flayers, which you don't fight too often, and some human spellcasters, like one we're going to see here in a moment, who, if you don't take him out fast, he could cast a level 4 Dissonant Whispers on you and really ruin your day. So that's the new equipment she's got. Let's talk a little bit about what we've done with the new levels we've gotten from going from level 8 to level 10. I put her new levels into Wizard, and the reason for this is because on this particular build, there aren't really any feats that would be especially beneficial. More levels of Fighter, more levels of Paladin aren't really going to be giving her anything useful for improving the damage she does on critical hits or improving her critical hit chance. So usually once I've gotten her basic 8 levels down, I usually just go with whatever's going to maximize the number of spell slots she has. And that ends up being Wizard once you factor in the arcane recovery that wizards get. There are a lot of other things you could do with these extra levels if you wanted to, which could be fun. You could take a level of Rogue to get an extra 2d6 damage on 1 crit per turn with the sneak attack. You could take Great Old One Warlock to inflict fear whenever you're critting things. That's cool, although I don't actually find it very useful because usually you're just killing things, so there's not really much benefit to having them be dead and afraid. You could also go up and get a feat, so you could get Savage Attacker, so you do a little bit more damage on criticals. But to be honest, the damage that Savage Attacker adds on small damage dice like d6s and d4s, mathematically it doesn't end up being a whole lot. So I'm not sure it's as valuable as just having more slots so you can smite more freely without having to be really stingy about them. Ultimately, once you've gotten the 3 levels of Fighter and 5 levels of Paladin that you need, the remaining 4 levels in this build are kind of yours to play with however you like. So that's our Dual Wielder. Now let's take a look at our Great Weapon Master. Unlike the Dual Wielder, this build actually does need a lot of feats to work well. So in particular, we took Great Weapon Master already because we needed that for the bonus action and for the damage. Another feat that we really need is Alert, because you'll notice, this character doesn't have much dexterity. We dumped it, and so with her dexterity very low, she's always going to be losing initiative. It's really important to get Alert so she can go early enough to kill something before it gets a turn. So at level 9, I gave her another level of fighter, bringing her up to level 4 to get alert. Once you have alert and great weapon master, I think that's the feats that this build really needs the most. But I would like to get one more feat because I would like to boost her strength up so she can get another +1 to hit. Because remember, the limitation of this unseen weapon menace is that once she misses, she becomes useless. So it's very important to me to do everything I can to avoid her ever missing any hits. So what I ended up doing is taking another paladin level, so eventually once I get level 11 and level 12, I can bring her paladin level up to 8 and get that feat to increase her strength. There are other options you could do instead of that. There are other feats that could be useful. Savage Attacker might not be bad. I haven't done the math on how much of a difference it makes with this particular build. You could take Wizard for more spell slots. I happen to like doing this as a level 4 fighter, level 8 paladin. So other than her new levels and feats, let's take a look at the new items she's gotten. We've got another reduction to her crit threshold through the Dark Justiciar helmet. So now she's going to be able to crit more reliably than what we saw in the demo a moment ago, where she didn't have this yet, and she also hadn't drunk the Elixir of Viciousness yet. She's also got another damage source from these Dark Justiciar gauntlets. Both of these are items that you pick up within the Gauntlet of Shar. Yep, and so that's the new stuff that she has. So again, without further ado, let's go take a look at how these builds perform in the wild. So I'm going to walk up and kill these thugs, who are pretty much the first fight in Act 3.
The place was empty.
If you want us to get our hands dirty...
I just want to remove these unlawful interlopers from my... I'm a very magnanimous individual, but this is my home! Either they leave, or I'll make them. Fine.
I respect your use.
Is the little dog.
The Guild, a loose coalition unifying every criminal outfit in the city.
You took the words right out.
I think you can actually intimidate her out of fighting, but I wanted to fight here because I want to see how this build looks.
Unleash me.
Alright, first things first. Like I said, we need to take out this guy who, if we don't kill him, he might cast Dissonant Whispers on my people who are all vulnerable to psychic damage right now. So let's kill this idiot. First try and crit. I'm not going to smite here because I've still got 2 more hits. I think I can finish him off. Yep. Alright, we didn't need to smite.
Alright, Karlak. It's go time. Well. Look.
I am fury.
Alright,
I am death.
I'll get there. Good. She could really attack either one of these, but I want to attack this one because you notice he's in darkness, so that will reduce
I will
crit
not
threshold.
know failure.
See, Minthara killed 1 person on her turn. Let's see if Lae'zel can kill 1 person on her turn. 16, 16, 21. 2 crits in a row. Here's another of the things that's nice about, that makes the dual-wielding build more consistent with the Great Weapon Master, is that if I end up in this situation where I can't reach anyone, I can always pull out my bow and shoot, and it's still fairly effective, unless that happens.
Blood comes easy these days. I'm talking. You can send an elf to sleep.
should have attacked this guy before I had Lae'zel walk away, because then he's still working. Weak to all of that psychic damage. I prefer to not let these people get any turns at all, but one guy getting one turn, I think that's fine. That was rude. Oops.
On your command, I am your death.
Oh, I think that's our first non-crit so far. That's okay. That's really a shame.
Victory awaits. No time to waste.
This should finish him off. And there we go. So as you can see, once you get to Act 3, these builds are, pretty good. I feel like, there are still things throughout Act 3 that are going to make them better, but I consider them like fully operational by this point. They're doing pretty well. So next up, we're going to take a look at how things will look towards the end of the game. So, as usual, we'll start off looking at the dual-wielding character. The main new thing is we've now gotten Bloodthirst from Orin. This essentially does the same thing as the Knife of the Undermountain King. It reduces crit threshold. I could use both of them to make the crit threshold really low, but I find once you get past about 16, there's diminishing returns on that. And I do like keeping Render of Mind and Body for the extra psychic damage. What's nice about Bloodthirst is if you do put it in your main hand, that's one less attack you're getting with the bonus psychic damage, but you're making things vulnerable to piercing, and that's going to be helping all of the attacks, plus it's helping our other character who's doing piercing. I haven't done the math to see which is better, but I think it's viable either in offhand or main hand. The other new piece of equipment we've gotten here is the Deadshot Bow, which further decreases her critical threshold. Although the limitation of having that is if I'm using this, I'm not using the Bow of the Banshee, which I do find quite useful for when she can't get into melee to reach someone. She can try to lock them down so they can't get into melee either. But for now, I'm using the Bow of the Banshee instead to reduce her crit threshold more. As for her levels, I think I did say last time that I was going to take her up to level 4 Wizard, but I ended up changing my mind because the additional level of Wizard doesn't give her a whole lot more in the way of spell slots. I think it gives her one more bit of arcane recovery, but again, it doesn't give a whole lot more spell slots, and she's already pretty good on spell slots. Gives a feat, but as I mentioned, there aren't really any feats that are helpful. So I did end up taking the level of Rogue so that she has, a free sneak attack she can do on rounds when she crits but doesn't want to use up a smite. So those are the improvements we've gotten to Lae'zel, our dual wielder. Now let's take a look at our Great Weapon Master. The main new piece of equipment is we've swapped out the Covert Cowl or Dark Justiciar Helm for Saravok's helmet. The main benefit of this is that now it grants the reduction to critical hit even when you're not in shadows. So you can be standing in the light and that will still work. I picked up the Ring of Regeneration so that it heals her every turn, so that this Brood Mother's Revenge will actually be doing the poison damage. I don't have to waste a bonus action to turn it on. Again, this isn't a huge deal because a lot of enemies in the game are immune to poison, but when you fight humanoids or things that are not immune to poison, it's a nice little source of extra damage. The other thing that would have been very nice, but that I missed out on, it would be nice to go to the Mirror of Loss and boost up her strength a little bit more. Normally that's something you would want towards the end game. I just finished the Mirror of Loss and I had very terrible luck with my rolls, even with 4 inspirations, a bardic inspiration, a guidance, a fox's cunning, and Warped Headband of Intellect, she still failed it 5 times, so she didn't get the strength boost. But in a normal playthrough, if you don't have as bad luck as I did, you'll probably be able to get that strength boost and, again, further protect against her missing her attacks. I think the only ingredient of these builds that I haven't picked up yet is Helldusk Gloves, which will do a tiny bit more damage than, a tiny bit more higher dice of damage than these do. Those you get at the House of Hope, which I haven't gone to yet, but once I have that, I'll swap those out. We went up to level 8 Paladin so she could get her last feat, and that was used to boost up her strength. So there we have it. Those are all the biggest pieces of the build going in. Now, to see the build in action at a point fairly late game, let's go kill Cazador's Tsar. And this is a fight that I hate, so I'm going to cheese it a little bit. Normally I don't like casting things before a fight starts, but I think I'm going to have to do it here, because if you don't, his aura is very nasty. I also didn't bother bringing Astarion because I don't want to start the fight with one character missing. So we're going to cast this big old sphere, fill up the whole place. That's going to make everyone mad, I think.
Well, that ends. Not as bad as it could have.
There we go, now we're in combat. He's upcasting it, it's probably worth canceling that. I'll lose my old monster, but I think that's okay. And since he's casting a high level spell, let's do Silent Backlash and do pretty big damage to him. You didn't do very well in initiative this time.
Victory awaits.
You can't even reach the guy.
It's as if. As much damage to him as we can before he turns into a gas cloud. That was unfortunate. Would have liked to do more than one crit in that turn, but these things happen. On my way. That's interesting. He is not steeped in bliss. I wonder if he's immune to that. I had been hoping a 4th level Dissonant Whispers would do a lot more damage than that, but he's not vulnerable to Psychic right now. Or maybe it's because he and Lae'zel are not on the same level. Not the spiritual weapon is steeped in bliss. Let's see if we can finish it here. Not if we don't crit. There we go. This should. And we need to take out these things before they nauseate us. Let's see, these are immune to poison damage, so the poison's not really helping them.
At once.
Now we get to wait 10 minutes while everything else takes its turn. One thing we did not do is kill this guy before he can cast things, but I've got a counterspell left if necessary. It's great that these things are cooperating by all bunching up for my Radiance of the Dawn. Concentration, so I don't need to counterspell it. I'll just kill this thing and that will wake Lae'zel back up. It might be hard to kill it. Why not? This, level 4 counterspell probably won't even work. If he comes close enough that Minthara can reach him, then we'll be able to take him out.
I wonder if this is worth the cost. Time to press ahead.
Getting closer without getting nauseated. There we go.
Worship me, the prophet of the end!
There we go. See, everything else up here is steeped in bliss. It's just that one
Swift
thing
and
that
lethal.
wasn't. Good job.
Need to act fast. Sometimes the only way out is through.
Over here! How placid is my foolish foe!
By my oath.
Need to stay focused. Blood comes easy these days.
I'm coming for you. Listen, you thou tree-loving leper.
Time to strike. I'm ready. Got to press on. So much for peace.
Let me strike.
Let's end this.
Your command.
I am fury.
All right,
I am death.
let's wrap this up. And there we have it.
The gods are watching me.
These are the almost end-game versions of both of these crit fishing builds. Now that we've seen the build in action throughout Acts 2 and 3, I also want to address a couple other alternative approaches that we could have taken to this build and that you can explore if you want to play it. First of all, there are other ways we could have tried to get constant advantage. These include the reckless attack ability from a barbarian. That's great, but it's kind of delaying your progression until Act 3 because you need 2 more levels of barbarian to get there, and that's using up levels that you might want elsewhere. That doesn't mean it's bad. It's still a good build. Before Honor Mode came out, I had a crit fishing paladin barbarian who killed Raphael in a single turn. I just don't think it's the best way of doing it. Another way we could be getting advantage most of the time is using the Gloves of the Growling Underdog. The limitation of that is it doesn't always work because you need to have 2 enemies close to you to get it. And it's using up one of your damage sources because normally we're going to want gloves that give us some extra damage. Another way you could have advantage all the time is getting help from someone else, like someone casting Fairy Fire, Wolf Barbarian, someone knocking an enemy prone. You could play around with darkness and blind sight. So there are a lot of ways to do it. This is fine. The limitations of it are, number one, you might not be able to do it all the time. For example, a Wolf Barbarian has limited rage charges per day. Your other characters might have better things they can be doing than being built around setting up your crit fisher. And you have the same problem as Growling Underdog, that it's not always going to work. If you try to use Darkness, there are enemies that have Blind Sight. If you try to use Fairy Fire, there are enemies that are going to pass their saving throw. And anyway, a more general issue I have with all of those approaches is that they require some time to set up, and combat in Baldur's Gate 3 happens very fast. The most effective thing to do in combat is to remove threats in the first turn. So I have been avoiding strategies that require getting set up in the first turn, because that's kind of sacrificing the most important turn in the fight, which is when you really want to be taking things out rather than setting yourself up to get crits on the next turn. So those were some other ways you could get advantage, which I haven't done here, but they could be good. You could explore ways of making them work. Another thing that we should explore is other weapons that you could be using. In the builds I've shown you, you're locked into certain weapons because you need them to reduce the crit threshold, but that won't always be the case. The reality is that once your critical threshold gets to around 16 or 17, there's not a whole lot of benefit to reducing it further. At that point, you're critting often enough to be effective. You're almost always critting at least once in every round. You can get your crit threshold down to as low as 13, but keep in mind the goal of this build is not really to crit as often as possible. It's to be an effective damage dealer, and that means you're going to have to sometimes make trade-offs, where sometimes it's more effective to increase your damage per crit rather than trying to get more crits. Here's a little example to illustrate the issue I'm talking about. So let's say
You could reduce your crit threshold even more by using the Shade Slayer cloak, which is a piece of equipment that reduces your crit threshold when you're hiding. But to be able to have this benefit on every attack, you're going to need 3 levels of Rogue so that you can hide on a bonus action, and you can do that twice per round. If you're doing that, you're sacrificing your bonus action, which you otherwise could be using for making another attack. You're using up those 3 levels to get 3 levels of Rogue, which you might have wanted to use those levels for something else. And you're probably limiting yourself to using ranged weapons, because like in melee you might not always have a chance to hide. You kind of need to be at range to be able to run to the good spot and hide there. So if you do that approach, you're going to get a higher percentage of critical hits, but you're not actually going to be doing as much damage. I've actually done a playthrough where all 4 of my characters were crit fishing builds, and one of them was this build, like Shade Slayer Cloak at range, Thief Rogue, so every turn she would hide attack, and that build wasn't bad, but it did do less damage than the other 3. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying that once your crit threshold is low enough and you have a way to get advantage all the time, you might not need to be locked into the weapons that I've shown here. If your crit threshold is already low, then maybe you don't need the Unseen Menace, or you don't need the Knife of the Undermountain King, and you can explore other potential synergies between critical hits and some of the many other good weapons in the game. Just like one example off the cuff is that a crit fisher with the Soulbreaker Greatsword would probably be amazing. It would do more damage than the Unseen Menace. It's got another damage source on it, and its initiative bonus would mitigate your need to take alert. So maybe you could, that would open you up to do other things. You would just need to find other ways of making sure you have advantage and making sure your crit threshold is down to around 16 or so. On the same note, you could explore other elixirs. Right? So if you can get your crit threshold down to 16 or 17 without the Elixir of Viciousness, then, for example, you could be drinking Elixir of the Colossus every day and having an extra damage source. All of this is to say there's a lot of different spins on this build you can do, other ways of getting advantage, other ways of reducing the crit threshold, other weapons that might do more damage or have other good effects. I encourage you to experiment around with the build and see what's fun. Now, with those alternatives out of the way, I want to discuss the limitations of the build. First, I'm going to respond to a few criticisms that I've seen around, which I don't think are actually limitations, and then I'll discuss some real limitations. Now, one criticism I've heard of this strategy is that there are better, meaning like more reliable, ways to get critical hits. For example, having an ally cast Hold Person and then attacking it. Now granted, if someone's cast Hold Person, you have a 100% chance of getting a critical hit on them if you walk up next to them. The problem that I have with this argument is that it assumes your goal is just to get critical hits. But as I've mentioned before, that isn't really my goal. The ultimate goal in this kind of game is to stop enemies from doing bad things to you. That's how you win fights. Trivially, you won the fight when there's nobody left to do anything to you, but more deeply, like, that's how you can get through more fights with the resources you have, because the more you can stop enemies from doing stuff to you, the less damage you take, and the longer you can keep on going before you need to take a long rest. Now, the most common way to stop enemies from doing stuff to you is to do enough damage to kill them. And I hope that I've shown in this video that building a crit fishing character is one out of many effective ways to do that. But the point of the character isn't really to get crits. It's to do damage and eliminate enemies, and getting crits happens to be an effective and fun way of doing that. So, with all of that logic in mind, the strategy of incapacitating someone with sleep or Hold Person just to get crits on them, it looks kind of wasteful. Once you've gotten someone Hold Personed, there's no point critical hitting them. Like, they're out of the fight, you've accomplished what you need to do. So at that point, it's best to go deal with other enemies who are a threat, and then come back and kill this last one at your leisure, because it's not a threat anyway. The other problem with the Hold Person plus crit strategy, or the sleep plus crit strategy, is that it's very resource intensive. you can afford to do it on the biggest threats, right? You can afford to cast Hold Monster on Raphael or the Ancient Red Dragon or something, but it's not something you're going to be doing to every enemy in every fight unless you want to do a kind of like one fight per day style of game. But the builds in this video, they can crit pretty reliably without having to use any of your daily resources on getting crits. And they still do have a few of those daily resources, like Luck of the Far Realms. For those cases where you really need a crit, you can guarantee it. So that's one criticism, which I don't think is actually a limitation. That leads to another criticism I've heard about this strategy, which is that it actually is resource intensive because it's using smites. That's a criticism that I have seen. But I hope I have shown in this video that this build is still effective even when you're not smiting. You don't need to be smiting on every critical hit for the build to be powerful. Like in the example fights that you've seen throughout this video, I actually didn't smite on most of my critical hits. The nice thing about this build is that you can save your spell slots for smites at the moments that you really need them, or maybe even for actual spells. I actually consider that one of the strengths of the build. I really like builds that are pretty good all the time and then also have options for turning them up to 11 when you really need to do something extra. On the other side, like I actually rarely play things like, for example, straight rogues, because that's a kind of build that's always good, but it doesn't really have anything extra they can do in a particularly hard fight. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, I rarely play straight wizards, because they're amazing when they're casting their big spells, but they're kind of useless when they're not. Personally, I have a lot of fun playing things like this crit fishing build because they have what I feel is like the perfect combination of being strong when you aren't spending your limited resources, but also having the ability to be even stronger at the moments when you need it. That's what I find fun. Alright, so those are the limitations which I kind of think you can safely ignore. But here's a few limitations that are actually true. The first two, I think, are not serious, but they're real limitations, and the last one is a big limitation. Alright, so the first real but not serious limitation is that this build is not very great at range. In the fights that you've seen in the video, my Dual-wielder still does half decent damage at range, but it's really just a backup for when she can't reach anyone. And the Great Weapon Master is almost useless at range. Now, I find this okay because by the time you're using these builds, you don't really need ranged attacks that often. I find range to be excellent in the early part of the game when you're so weak that the best strategy is often to cheese fights by using stuff like web and taking the enemy out of range, things like that. But by the time you have these crit fishing builds, they can steamroll just about any fight. There are a select few fights in the game where you really do want range attacks, and I'm thinking things that hurt you if you attack them in melee, like the Needle Blights or the Necromites. And when you get into these fights, you're going to want to make sure you have someone in the party who is good at range, because these builds don't really offer that. The next true but not too serious limitation of the build is that it doesn't have very much defense. These characters they're not exactly glass cannons, but with these builds you're not going out of your way to improve their defenses. Like the only good defensive stuff you get is when it doesn't conflict with stuff that would max their offense. So for example, they both have good armor because I don't need their armor anyway for crits. But other than that, I'm not going out of my way to give them good defense. I don't really think this is a problem because, like, as everyone knows, the best defense in this kind of game is offense. You defend yourself by killing everything before it gets a turn. And all that said, their defense actually isn't terrible. Like, they're paladins, so they have pretty high AC, and they have access to useful defensive spells. So this I don't find to be a huge limitation. But last, there is one limitation that is real, and it really is serious. That's the one that I mentioned towards the beginning of the video. It's the fact that this build doesn't get good until Act 2. That is a real problem. Act 1 is the hardest act in the game, because that's when your characters are the weakest. By the time you reach Acts 2 and 3, your characters are strong enough that they'll be able to overcome any challenge with just about any reasonable build. So like you don't even really need a powerful build in Acts 2 and 3. It's just fun to have. Act 1 is the place where you really need the help, and this build won't cut it in Act 1. So for Act 1 in Honor mode, you're really going to need some of the other powerful builds in your party to keep you alive until you get to the place where the crit fishing build becomes viable. Personally, I usually go through Act 1 with at least a Tavern Brawler Monk and a Sharpshooter in my party at all times. And the people who are eventually going to be crit fishers, they either stay in camp or they come along for fights, but they don't contribute very much. All right, so that about wraps things up. We have looked at what ingredients it takes to make a crit fishing build work. We've looked at 2 examples of the build at 3 different points in the game, and we've reviewed what items and abilities are effective. We've seen the build in action a few times, and we've reviewed alternative options and limitations of the build. I hope I have convinced you here that crit fishing in Baldur's Gate 3 is not just a joke build and is not suboptimal, but it can actually be an effective approach even in Honor mode. But most importantly, I hope you'll try it out. I hope you'll have fun with it, and maybe even find some new twists on it that are better or more fun than what I've shown here. Enjoy!